so many times when I was interviewing Jeter, I would get to my computer, go through the quotes, and I'm like, all right, he didn't really give us anything. He talked a lot, but he didn't give us anything. With Gooden, like you said, he was a shy guy. He didn't say much of anything, but he was very reserved. It wasn't he wasn't a controversy waiting to happen. Whereas with Strawberry, he didn't worry about popping off because he was, that was his personality. If he had something on his mind, he was going to say it. I think the difference with the two, and maybe why Strawberry got certainly more negative or more negativity or more criticism than Gooden did, is because there was this perception that Gooden or the Strawberry wasn't living up to his potential. Whatever that was, there was this absurdly high bar set for Strawberry. I keep saying that. That somehow he was supposed to be this guy who was going to hit 300 with 50 home runs and 140 RBIs, which obviously is unrealistic for any player, except maybe Mike Trout. But how do you expect any player to live up to that standard? And it's impossible. And that I think was part of what the issue was with the media and with Strawberry. But like you said, I mean, I think because Gooden wasn't seen as the quote-unquote troublemaker like Strawberry was, and again, I don't really think Strawberry was a troublemaker. He was just a guy who spoke his mind. But because Gooden was seen as that quieter guy and, look how good he is, and he's just blowing fastballs by people, that, like you said, they gave him a little bit more of a pass on things. And obviously there was other things going on that nobody found out about until after the fact.
True, and I think even you look at the on-the-field stuff, I mean, when you look at the 86 season and the postseason, people mention a lot of things, and they credit Gary Carter and Keith Hernandez, and those guys deserve all the credit in the world. But I think the thing that gets under the radar is if Strawberry doesn't hit a homer off Nepper and Nolan Ryan,
for sure,
the Astros are in the World Series.
Yep, absolutely.
And I think if you go to a Met fan and ask them, they'll talk about Dykstra's walk-off. They'll talk about Carter's walk-off. They'll talk about, a lot of the Buckner play, obviously. Mm-hmm. But nobody ever brings up those two moments in the middle of that NLCS that kind of defined the series and pushed it another way. Not to mention the home run that kind of ended the World Series and kind of put the game finally out of reach for the Red Sox. Right. And I think that, and I got to know Darryl well and consider him a friend. And I think that I've talked to him a lot about that. And, he's so spiritually minded now that I think that none of this stuff bothers him anymore. But when he was that age, I think it did bother him. And then when the general manager, when you're going for a contract, comes out and kind of pretty much says that he doesn't think you're a star player after what you've done for the team, I think I'd be on my way to Los Angeles just the way he was as well.
We're talking with Rich Coutinho. He is the author of Pressbox Revolution, How Sports Reporting Has Changed Over the Past 30 Years, published by Skyhorse Publishing. He will be at Foley's Pub tonight, Monday, May 22nd, 2017, at 5 p.m. doing a book signing. I want to just say one more thing about Strawberry and Gooden. The interesting thing about them nowadays is that Strawberry is probably given a little more respect from the press than Dwight Gooden is. It seems like it's switched off because of how Darryl Strawberry has reclaimed his life, and Doc Gooden seems to be still not sure where he is. And it is interesting, especially after the documentary, the 30 for 30 documentary about them. Right. You notice the press and being much, I don't say nicer to Darryl Strawberry, but Darryl's also been nicer too. So it's interesting how that's kind of switched. And about Winfield and Mattingly, I never liked Dave Winfield. I never thought of him as a Yankee. Now, mind
you're not
you,
even a Yankee fan.
I know that, but it's like when the Yankees get Randy Johnson. Like that. There's certain embracement of New York that you have to have the play in New York, and I never thought Dave Winfield embraced New York. It just seemed like it was just like a career move, not a baseball career move, a career move.
Well, I'll say real quick, I agree with what Rich was saying to a certain extent as far as Mattingly and Winfield go, but while that argument there certainly were some racial overtones to it. I think that Mattingly just was favored by the fans just because he was a homegrown Yankee. And
That's
let's face it, fans love homegrown Yankees, especially Yankee fans, because there weren't that many of them, especially back in those days. So I thought that was the reason. I mean, Dave Winfield was a great ball player. There was no denying that. And that season certainly was something of an outlier for him in terms of batting average. But that was always my perception, is that, all right, fans are rooting for a young, homegrown Yankee who they want to win the title. I mean, me personally, I would have been happy either one of them winning it. But
it was a great run. People forget about how close they were at the end. Batting
yeah, it
average
was the last game of the season that really dictated it. And then throw in the fact of what the owner of the team might have been trying to do with Winfield.
Oh, yeah.
That's true, too. Good point. Good point.
And because I mean, Steinbrenner was always trying to
stir the pot.
massage the narrative also, and obviously he was not a Dave Winfield fan after everything that happened with the contracts and Howie Spira and everything else. So he probably wanted to shift some of the focus away from Winfield, or at least as much as he could. So yeah, I mean that's certainly a fair point as well.
Rich,
and I also wrote in the book a little bit about George. And listen, does George deserve to be in the Hall of Fame? Probably, I would say he does, because he did change the game. Mm-hmm. But just like you got to look at the whole report card with players that may have been suspended or not suspended for use of steroids, you can't just throw the 2 times that George got in trouble with baseball and got suspended. You can't just put that to the side. And I know people remember the George in the later years, and the George that was easy to love, and like
the kinder,
you looked at him like your Uncle
George.
Sal. But I remember the George.
And you have an Uncle Sal. You mentioned you've your Uncle Sal in the book.
Yes, I did. And my uncle, I'll get to my uncle in a second, but George did things that just defied description. I remember one day, Mets were playing the Yankees, and it was a Saturday afternoon, and the Mets, killed the Yankees. I even think Roger Cedeno had one of his few great days as a Met. And George used to be in the booth right next to the radio booth. And so we were looking in there, and every time the Mets got ahead, he'd frown. He had all his friends and the Billy Crystals of the world in the booth with him, and he was expecting a big Yankee win, and he didn't get it. And the next day when we got to the ballpark, a blue plate of glass was put between our radio booth and George's booth, so we couldn't look in and see him. And those are the kind of things that George did. Mm-hmm. In the mid-'80s, when you covered the Yankees, you needed 2 reporters, one to cover the game and one to follow George, like he was George's shadow, and because you never knew what George was going to do. And so we talk a lot about social media in the book. Can you imagine what social media would have been like when Billy, George, and Reggie were going at it in the late 70s? That could have blown the door off Twitter forever. And when you think about it and you say teams were successful, the mid-'80s Mets, the late 70s Yankees, would they have been successful in the current state? It's a great question. I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that it would have been covered very differently than it was in those times.
Let me ask you this, Rich. I'm going to throw this at you because you just mentioned this. Do you think George Steinbrenner would have been much like Donald Trump on Twitter?
I do. I think he may have been worse.
I do too.
I mean, I think, especially, can you imagine? I think you guys might remember this 1980 Royals played the Yankees in the championship series, and the Yankees, I think, won over 100 games that year,
yeah, right.
and they get swept. And there's a play late in the game where a Yankee gets thrown out at the plate, and George kind of throws his hands and as if to say, "Oh, get out of here!"
Yeah, that's a pretty
Could
famous.
you imagine if George had a Twitter account right after that?
Oh, so the third base coach would have gotten roasted. The umpires would have gotten roasted. The guy who got thrown out at the plate would have gotten. I mean, everybody would have probably gotten their own tweet. And who knows? Hashtag spit the bit. I don't know.
Even you go into more recent. Can you imagine with Twitter if the day Joe Torre batted A-Rod 8th in the playoffs, what the Twitter world would have done?
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting thing to kind of juxtapose. But there are a lot of personalities in this town, but George on Twitter might have broken Twitter. It really might have.
It would have been a different thing because, think about the reporters who were covering. We've had Bill Madden on the show, and he, of course, wrote a great book about George Steinbrenner. But a lot of that conversation was off the record. He would call, these different reporters. It wasn't just Bill Madden, and feed stories. And if he's feeding it through Twitter, maybe it doesn't work as effective because everyone knows right away that George did it. It's George's account, so. That might be one of the problems. I want to bring up a couple of people you talk about in the book that some people don't think about anymore just because time has passed. Howard Cosell and Dick Young. Of course, Howard Cosell was a sports reporter. He did Monday Night Football, of course, boxing. And Dick Young, of course, a longtime Daily News and then New York Post beat writer or columnist.
Young ideas.
You talk about both of them in the book. Both of them were thought of to be kind of ornery, to be nice about them.
It's a good word.
You sort of have a different view on those two.
I do, and we'll talk about Cosell first. And I worked at ABC Radio Sports and got to know Howard at that time. And Howard was at the tail end of his career. He wasn't really doing much TV anymore. He was pretty much doing radio, and then his syndicated show got pulled off WABC. But the first day I ever met Howard Cosell, and I was working in the studio on a typewriter. Yes, there were typewriters back when I'm that old. There weren't computers. And Howard walks in and he looks at me and he says, "Who the hell are you?" And I turned to him and I said, "I'm Rich Coutinho. Who are you?" And he looked at me. He gave me that same line he had in The Odd Couple years ago when he said, "Who am I? I'm the single most recognizable sports voice in America." So I turned to him and I said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Musburger." And at that time, Howard and Brent weren't on the same channel. Brent ended his career at ABC, but then he was at CBS.
Right.
And they were bitter rivals. And we kind of looked at each other in silence, and then he started to laugh. And Howard used to love introducing me by telling people that's what I did to him. He did it. We went Al McGuire one night, and he did it. And Al McGuire looked at me and said, "Oh, Rich, you're my hero." But I think that I got a lot of good talks with Howard, too, and talked to him about the industry. And I look at Monday Night Football now, and I never thought it could ever fall to where it is now. And I thought the things that Howard did, he made it a social event. And still to this day, bars across the country try to, brand Monday Night Football as a big night to go out and have some drinks and have some food at a bar. And Howard Cosell brought all that. Football was pretty much a Sunday afternoon thing before he got into Monday Night Football. And he made it a national event. And was Howard perfect? No, he wasn't perfect. I saw Howard really verbally undress people in the worst way. But I got to know him late in his career, and I'll give you another quick story. We were working on the whole Mike Tyson rape trial story, and we were having trouble getting people to come on with us and talk about it. And Howard comes in the office one day and he gives me this piece of paper. He goes, "Call this guy." I said, "Who is he?" He goes, "Rich, just don't give me a heartache, man. Just call him." Okay? So I called him. I says, "I'm Rich Coutinho. I was told to call this number." And he goes, "Oh, hi, Rich. I've heard a lot about you. This is Muhammad Ali."
Nice.
And I was able to do an interview with Muhammad Ali. And then after we did the interview, Muhammad goes, "So how you doing with your career? Where do you want your next step to go?" Like I'm having a career development conversation after an interview with Muhammad Ali. And I only did it because of him. And it was so many people that he gave me numbers to. Pete Rozelle, Tom Lasorda, Bobby Bowden. People loved him. People loved Howard. And I think the thing that people didn't understand, Howard had a tremendous ego. And I think it hurt him late in his career because he became very bitter. And when bitter people with an ego start talking, it usually doesn't create good feelings in the industry. And but I had great talks with him, and I learned a lot about the business from him. And he's also someone that created a lot of the way the business is today. And he was sports talk radio before it ever occurred. And Howard, to me, is a Hall of Fame broadcaster that deserves every accolade in the world. But I think when people bring up his name, I hear more negative than positive. And that really makes me feel bad. It really does. As far as Dick Young is concerned, I met him when he was in the tail end of his career, and he was an ornery guy. But
Yeah.